And then let's begin building out our header. So we're going to have an import here of user button, which is a component that is coming from Clerk React like so. So user button, it is capitalized. And then we're going to import the $sign, and then we're going to import the menu as well as the X from Lucid React, and then we're going to import use state and use effect as well. And then the header is going to be taking a prop here called current page, and then on page change, just like we saw previously. And then it's going to have some state values. So const is menu open and set is menu open. This is going to equal to use state, and by default it is going to be false because we don't want to show the mobile menu by default. Now let's create some state here for our navigation. So const links is equal to, and we're going to say this is going to be an array of objects. We're going to say that the name for this is going to be dashboard, and then the ID is going to say dashboard, because remember that we're navigating using the components and not actual pages. And then let's copy this 2 more times. So 1, 2. This is going to say reports. This is going to say small letter reports. This is going to say settings. This is going to say settings with a small s, like so. And then we're going to call our use effect here with a dependency array of the current page, so that when the current page changes, then we're going to call set is menu open to false, so that it closes our mobile sidebar. Now instead of a div, we're going to return a header element with a class name here of border dash bottom, and then border dash neutral dash 800 max width dash 7xl, and then mx dash auto. And then inside we're going to return a div with a class name of max width dash 7xl mx auto, and then padding on the x of 4. And then inside this div we're going to return another div with a class name of flex and items dash center justify dash between, and then give it a height of 16. And then this is going to have an h1 with an on click here that is going to be an arrow function, or rather an inline function, which is going to call the on page change function, where we want to change the page into the dashboard. So basically when you click on the logo of the application. Now this is going to have a class name here of text dash xl font dash bold, and then text dash white, and then cursor dash pointer, and then the h1 is going to say expenser. Now below the h1, and actually you can save that to see what I have on the screen, right, that right there. Now below the h1 we're going to have a div with the class name of hidden, and then on medium screens we're going to say flex, and then items as center, and then space on the x of 8. And then inside this we're going to have a nav element with a class name of flex, and then space on the x of 6. And then inside here we're going to map over our links. So links.map, and then for every item that we get back, the object that we get back, I'm calling it an item, we're going to return a button here with the key of item.id. And then when you click on this button, we're going to be calling an inlet function. We're going to say on page change, we want to change it into the item.id. So basically this right here, so that it switches into the settings or the reports or the dashboard. Now this button is going to have a class name here, which are going to be dynamic. So passing a backticks, and then we're going to say transition dash colors, and then text dash sm, and we don't need the text small. What am I doing? And then we're going to have a $sign here, where we're going to check if the current page is triple equal to the item.id, because that means that we are on that particular page and we want to apply some styles. So if that is true, then we're going to apply the class name of text white and then underline. Otherwise we're going to apply text neutral dash 300, and then on hover we're going to say text dash white, and then the text for the button is going to say the item name. Now below the nav element here, we're going to return the user button component from Clerk. Now I can save that, and this is what I have on the screen. So I'm currently on the dashboard page, so I can click on the reports, it's going to show the reports page, and settings is going to show the settings page, and then this is our user button, which can use to manage account or to sign out. So back inside the dashboard page, and actually we are on the header. So below this user button and then below the div, we can go ahead and create another div with a class name of medium screens. It is going to be hidden, and then we're going to have a button here. The button is going to go ahead and be checking if is menu open is true. Now if this is true, then we're going to render out the X icon. This X icon is going to have a class name here of size-6, and then otherwise we're going to render out the menu icon with a class name of size-6 once again, and then close it out. And the on click for this button is going to be calling an inline function here called set is menu open to the opposite of is menu open. So if it is true, then set it false, and if it is false, then set it to true, basically creating the toggle. Now it is going to have a class name of text-neutral-300, and then on hover it's going to have a class name of text-white, like so. Now if I save that and go into the mobile view, you notice that what we're talking about is this menu right here. So I can open that up and then I can close it. Now we can't see anything because we have not created any items inside our menu, but we can go ahead and do that right away. So we're going to go below this button and then below two divs, and then we're going to check if is menu open is true, and only when it is true, that's when I want to go ahead and create this div with a class name of medium screens hidden, padding on the Y of 4, border dash top, and then border dash neutral dash 800. Close that out and close out the div, and then we're going to render out the nav element once again with a class name here of flex dash column and space on the Y of 4. And then when you close out the nav, then we're going to map over our links once again. So links.map, and then for every item that you get back, because now we're creating the mobile menu, we're going to return a button. And you know what, there's no need to type that or type that out again. So let's just copy this, and then we're going to return the button right there, because it is still going to have a key of that. When you click on that, it's going to be changing the page. The class names are going to remain the same as well. And then of course below this, we're going to return a div with a class name of padding top of 2, where we're going to render out the user button, because remember that this is now the mobile menu. So save that, and then now if we test it out once again, you can see that this is the mobile menu, and close it and open it up as you please. Fantastic. Now that we have the header, we can begin to build out our dashboard, or rather we can continue to build out our dashboard. So our dashboard is going to have a bunch of components which I want to go ahead and create, because we're going to be importing them somewhere. So let's first of all navigate into dashboard. Now our dashboard is going to have a component here called stats card. So stats card, which is coming from /stats card, because we're in the same folder. And then you can copy this down a bunch of times. This second one is going to say expense form. This is going to say expense list. This next one is going to say category chart, and then next it is going to say month filter. Now let's go ahead and create these components. So inside the components folder, create a new file called statscard.jsx, rfc, enter, save. Next one is called expense form, JSX, rfc, save, enter. Next one is called expense list, JSX, rfc, enter. Next is called category chart, rfc, save and exit. And the next one is called month filter.jsx, rfc, enter, save, and then we can continue to build out our dashboard without having errors of the components. Now our dashboard is going to be having some state values. So const show form and set show form is going to be equal to useState, and by default it is going to be false, because we don't want to show the expense form by default. and then const editing expense, so whether you're editing or not. So editing expense and set editing expense is equal to use state. By default it is going to be null, and then const selected month and set selected month is going to be equal to use state. By default we're going to pass in the new date so that you can get the current date for today, or that just get the current date. What am I even saying? Now apart from that, we're going to be having some other functions from Convex which we need to create. So we're going to be getting the expenses. So expenses, this is going to be equal to use query, and this is going to be coming from api.expenses. Remember that now we need to go ahead and create this function .expenses.list expenses, and then this is going to be taking in the user .id. So we want to check if that is true. Then the user ID, we're going to set it equal to the user.id. Otherwise, if it has not yet loaded, we want to skip the query. Now skip is something that Convex provides, so that if this doesn't exist, so that if it evaluates to false, then you can simply skip the query so that it doesn't evaluate to null. And then const category totals, category totals is equal to use query, and we're going to say api.expenses.get total by category, and this is also going to be checking if the user .id exists. If it does, then we want to go ahead and pass in the user ID as the user.id, and then otherwise we want to skip the query if it has not yet loaded, and check the capitalization. This is capital I, don't make that mistake like me. Now we need to go ahead and create these two functions. So inside Convex, we're going to create a new file called expenses.js, and then inside expenses, we're going to say import v from Convex values, import mutation, and then query. Now something that I am going to do is that whenever we create a new file for Convex, we're going to create all the functions that we're going to need for that particular file, so that we don't have to keep on jumping back and forth. So we're going to create export const create create expense, but I call it create. This is going to be equal to mutation here, and then arguments are going to be as follows. If we just check the schema, you can get the expenses right here. So you can copy and then paste them here, so that don't type that all, or we don't type all that out. We can remove the created that and the updated that, and then we can have our handler function here, which is an asynchronous function taking in the context as well as the arguments, where we're going to return, we're going to say const now is equal to date.now to get the current time, and then we're going to say return await context.db.insert, and we're inserting into the expenses database. And what do we want to insert? We want to insert everything inside the arguments that we have just passed, and then we want to pass in the created at, where we're going to pass in the now that we have just destructed there, and then the updated at as well, pass in as now. And then the next function is going to say export const list, so basically list expenses, and then this is a query because we are querying the database. Is going to be taking the argument of the user ID, in this case, which is v.string, and then our handler function is going to be an asynchronous function, once again taking the context as well as the arguments, where we're going to say return await context.db.query. We are querying the expenses database, and we're querying it with index of by user ID. Remember, we created that, and then we're going to pass in a callback function here, where we're going to say q.equals, and we want to check if the user ID that is provided equals the arguments .user ID that we have in the database, and then we want to order them in descending order, and then we want to collect them so that it shows all the expenses. So that is that. And then the next function is export const get by date range. This is going to be equal to a query, and this is going to be taking in the arguments of user ID passed in as v.string. It's going to have a start date passed in as v.number. It's going to have the end date passed in as v.number as well. And then the handler function is going to be an asynchronous function. Context arguments, you can see it has some repetition. That's why I was tempted to just copy and paste it. Instead, you're going to return await context.db.query. Once again, we're querying the expenses table with the index of by user and date. So by user and date, pass in a callback function here. We're going to say q.equals the user ID, and then pass in the arguments dot user ID, and then we're going to say dot gte. We're going to pass in the date, and then arguments dot start date, and then once again dot lte, which is going to be the date, and then pass in the arguments dot end date, like so. And then we want to order them in descending order, and then we want to collect all of them like so. And that is the function. This should be a string, so descending like so. And this is basically the greater than and then the less than. Next, we have our update function. So export const update. This is going to be equal to a mutation. We're going to pass in the arguments here. It's going to be taking the ID, which is v.id, and it is coming from the expenses table. And then the amount is v.optional, because when you are updating your data, everything that you're updating is optional because it is already in the database. So v.optional and then v.number. And then the next one is the description, which is once again v.optional and then v.string. Then the next one is category, which is v.optional and then v.string. And then the next one is the date, which is v.optional and then v.string, like so. And then we're going to have our handler async context arguments, like so. And then we're going to say this const id, destructure the id, and then get all the updates that you want to pass. So updates, and this is going to be equal to the arguments. So just destructure them because it's going to be easier. Where we're going to say return await context.db.insert. So not insert but patch, because we are updating the database and we want to pass in the ID, and then open up an object here, pass in all the updates that we have or updates that we have made, and then the updated at time is going to be the date.now. So that is our update function. Next is the remove function. So export const remove is equal to a mutation, and this is going to have some arguments here. So it's going to have an argument of v or of id rather, which is coming from v.id, and we want to get the id from the expenses table. And then the handler function is going to be an asynchronous, taking in the context and then the arguments. So context, I hope it did not import anything on top. Okay, sometimes it auto imports. And then we're going to say await, or the return await context.db.delete, and we're deleting the arguments.id that we have. And then next we have the get total by category. So export const get total by category, and this is going to be equal to query. And you know what, probably the delete function should come last, and then this is going to taking in the arguments of user ID, which comes from v.string. And then the handler here is going to be an asynchronous function, taking the context and then the arguments. We're going to say const expenses is equal to await context.db.query the expenses table with index of by user ID, then pass in a callback function here called q. We're going to say q.eq equals the user ID and check the arguments that user ID, and then dot collect to get all the expenses. And then we're going to say const category totals is equal to an empty object, and then we're going to say expenses dot for each expense. Then we're going to say category totals, and then pass in the expense.category is equal to the category totals, pass in the expense.category or 0, and then now add in the expense.amount. So then once you do that, then you can return object.entries because it is an object, so you want to transform it into an array. Pass in the category totals.map, and then open this up and then open up an array. You want to get the category and then the total, and then outside of this you can open up an object here where we're going to say that we want to get back the category and then the total. Okay, that was quite long. We can save that, and we have an issue here. Category is not defined because this should say category totals. Now I can save that, and then back inside our dashboard we now have, I saw it updating, so I thought it had updated something, but nothing. So back inside our dashboard we are now going to go below the use effect, and inside our dashboard we're going to be having some functions. So we're going to have a function called handle edit expense. This is going to be an arrow function like so. So just leave it as empty. We're going to have another function here called handle form close. Separate them out. And then we're going to have another function here called filtered expenses. And this is not really a function. It's more of like a value. And this is where we're going to be using use memo. So here what we're going to do is, let's do it like this. So is equal to use memo, and we're going to call this, and then memo takes in an array here where and this is going to be dependent on the expenses, and then it is also going to be dependent on the selected month, so that it can memorize the values, that we don't have to recalculate this every single time because it is going to be too expensive. And then we're also going to have total expenses, but total expenses is more of a value. So let's just begin to build out our UI. So this is going to have a class name here of main height dash screen, and then bg dash transparent, and then inside this we're going to have a main element with the class name of max width dash 7xl mx dash auto, padding on the x of 4, then padding on the y of 8, and then inside this we're going to have a div with the class name of margin bottom of 8, and then an h1 with the class name of text dash 3xl and font dash bold, text dash white, and then margin bottom of 2, and then the text is going to say dashboard. And then below the h1 we're going to have a paragraph here with the class name of text neutral dash 300, and then the text is going to say track and manage your expenses. Now if we save that, we're simply going to see that on the screen. We have an issue somewhere, probably because of the function that I've just created. List expense. Oh, we call the function list. That's what I called it. There we go. So now we have our dashboard right there. Track and manage your expenses. And then we're going to go below this div, and we're going to create another div with a class name of margin bottom of 6. And this div is going to render out the month filter component, and the month filter is going to be taking the selected month prop, which is going to be equal to the selected month state value, and then on month change prop is going to be equal to set selected month like so. Close it out, and then we're going to render out the stats card like so, and the stats card is going to be rendering or they're taking in a prop here called total expenses. This is going to be equal to total expenses, and then monthly expenses is going to be equal to monthly expenses, and then expense count is equal to filtered expenses dot length, so the number of them. Now you can see right here that total expenses and monthly expenses is not defined, so let's go ahead and create them so that we don't get any errors. So const total expenses is equal to the expenses, so we want to check if there are any expenses, so question mark dot reduce, So that is called optional chaining, so that you don't have to get or that you don't get an error if your value is undefined. Dot reduce, and then pass in the sum and then the expense. Can't type expense as well. We're going to say sum plus expense dot amount, then pass in 0, otherwise return 0. That is the total expenses, which I misspelled. And then const monthly expenses is going to be equal to the filtered expenses dot reduce, and then we're going to pass in the sum and the expense as well. We're going to say sum plus I can't type plus expense dot amount and pass in 0, like so. Now obviously you can tell that now we need to go ahead and create our filtered expenses, but our application should still be able to run before we do all that. Now below the stats card right here, we're going to create a div with a class name of grade, and grade dash columns dash 1, and then large screens we're going to say grade dash columns dash 3, and then give it a gap of 8, and then margin top of 8 as well. And then inside here we're going to create a div with a class name of large screens called dash span dash 2, that it spans 2 grid columns. And then inside that we're going to create another div with a class name of flex, and then items dash center, and then justify between, and then margin bottom of 6. And then inside here we're going to have an issue with the class name of text dash xl, font dash bold, and then text dash white, and then it's going to say recent expenses. And then below the h2 we're going to have a button here with an on click. So on click we're going to be calling an inline function here. It's called set show form into true, so that we can now show our form to create an expense. The text is going to be showing the plus icon with a class name of size dash 4, so width and height of 4, and the text is going to say add expense. Now the button is going to have some class names here of bg white, and then on hover we're going to say bg white /75, and then text dash neutral dash 900, and then font dash bold, and then padding on the y of 2, padding on the x of 4, rounded dash large, then flex items dash center, justify dash center, and then gap of 2, and then transition dash colors. And then if I go ahead and save that, we should be able to see something on the screen. F12 was the issue. Reading reduce, dashboard number 46, 9 number 46, filtered expenses. Okay, so it means that we have to create this because it can't read reduce when this is empty. So let's go ahead and create that right away. So use memo is right here. So we're going to open this up, and then we're going to say if there are no expenses, then return an empty array. And then if there are expenses, then we're going to say return expenses dot filter. Then for every expense that we get back, then we're going to say const expense date is equal to new date, then pass in the expense dot date, because that is how we are storing it in Convex. And then we're going to return once again, and we're going to return the expense date dot get month, and check if this is equal to the selected month dot get month. So, and the expense date dot get full year, and check if this is equal to the selected month dot get full year. So, and then this is dependent on the expenses and then the selected month. So save that, and then now we should be able to see something. There you go. So we have recent expenses and then add expense. Why is that misaligned? it is misaligned because of Y. So BG White, hover BG White, flex is here, item center, so I misspelled that, so center. And there we go, fantastic. Now when I click on this, it should show the expense form which we have not yet created. So we're going to create that as well as we go along. Now we're going to go below this button and then below this first div, and then we're going to render the expense list component like so. The expense list is going to be taking the expenses prop, which is going to be equal to the filtered expenses like so, and then it's going to have an on edit function, which is going to be calling the handle edit expense function, which is currently empty on top. And then we're going to go below this div. We're going to create another div with an h2 with a class name of text-xl, font-bold, text-white, and then margin bottom of 6. And then this is going to say spending by category. And then below the h2, we're going to render out the category chart. And the category chart is going to take in a data prop, which is going to be equal to the category totals, or if there are no category totals, it is simply going to be an empty array. And then we're going to go below the main element right here, and then we're going to say we want to check if show form is true, and only when show form is true, that's when we want to render out the expense form component. Now the expense form here is going to be taking the expense prop, and this is going to be equal to the editing expense function, and then on close prop once again is going to be calling the handle on close like so. So now when I save it and look at that, now we have our category right here, we have our expense list right there, we have our expense form right there, and we have our month filter right there. So now if I click on this, it should show the expense form. If I reload that just to demonstrate, ooh, the loading animation is bad. But look at this, if I click on the add expense, it shows the expense form. Fantastic. Now let's fix the loading animation first of all. So loading spinner, this I think should be outside of the div. Save that, because that should be a select closing div. There we go, much better. Now let's go ahead and deal with our month filter component first of all, because I want to go down the line. So this is the first component, and then the stats card, and then the expense list, and then this one, and then probably the expense form. So month filter first.